Let's now talk about leverage. Leverage is simply the use of borrowed money in which to gain control of the property. Leverage is used for a number of reasons. One is we may just not have enough cash in which to buy the property. And the other, probably more important reason for using leverage is leverage gives us the opportunity to amplify our return. Now, before we get into our discussion of leverage and the numbers and how it works, let's talk briefly about some of the concepts and also definitions that I'm going to use as we go through the material. Financial leverage is the use of borrowed funds to amplify the outcome of equity investments. The greater the ratio of borrowed funds to the equity, the greater the degree of financial leverage. Leverage is said to be favorable so long as the rate of return on the assets exceeds the cost of borrowing. In addition, spread is the difference between the rate of return on the assets and the cost of the borrowing. Favorable spread magnifies the return on equity of highly leveraged investments. When the debt service constant is less than the rate of return on the total assets, additional financial leverage increases the cash flow to the equity position, and just the reverse is true as well. When the debt service constant is greater than the rate of return on the assets, additional financial leverage decreases the cash flow to the equity position. What I'm going to do now is work through 3 different scenarios demonstrating leverage and its impact on the current yield to the investors. First of all, let's look at this scenario. We have a property that is encumbered by a 30-year fixed loan. Now, all I'm doing at this point is working through the same numbers that appear on our spreadsheet. The net operating income is $66,964. And in these 3 different scenarios, that will not change. First scenario, we're dealing with no loan at all on it. So the before tax cash flow is the same, $66,964. The way this transaction is structured, it has the purchase price was $1,400,000. There's no loan. So the equity invested is $1,400,000. As far as now the mortgage constant, well, there is no mortgage, so that's not applicable. Return on assets, that's simply taking the net operating income, $66,000 and some change, and dividing that by the $1,400,000. That is 4.78%. And because there is no loan, well, the yield to the investor is the same, 4.78. Now, let's change the scenario, and we're going to include a loan of $674,410, and that's coming right off the spreadsheet that we had done earlier. Again, net operating income, $66,964. Annual debt service on that loan, and again, remember it's a 30-year loan, 6.95%. The debt service, $53,571, which leaves a before-tax cash flow of $13,393. Now, we're again looking at the structure of the transaction. It's $1.4 million purchase price. The loan was $674,410. Again, remember that was the maximum that we could finance because of the debt coverage ratio. So if that's the loan, the equity position is $725,590. The mortgage constant is 7.94. And remember, mortgage constant is nothing more than taking the debt service, principal and interest, and dividing that by the loan amount. Return on assets, again, that's just taking the net operating income of $66,964 and dividing it by the cost or the purchase price, $1,400,000. And that results in return of 4.78%. And then finally, the yield. The yield is nothing more than taking the before tax cash flow of $13,000 and dividing it by $725,000. That leaves a return of 1.85%. Now we're doing a $750,000 loan. I don't think we're able to get that through the lender, but let's look through this. Net operating income doesn't change, $66,964. The debt service on this loan of $750,000 is $59,580, principal and interest, which leaves the difference between those two a before tax cash flow of $7,384. The structure is a purchase price $1,004,000. The loan is $750,000. The equity position is $650,000. That results in a mortgage constant of 7.94%, and then the return on the assets is 4.78, and the current yield to the owners 1.14. So what happened on this? Because the mortgage constant was greater than the return on the assets, any increase in the financing on the property resulted in a decrease in the rate of return or the return to the investors. Let's now look at a different scenario. In this scenario, we're looking at a loan which is interest only. And how does that impact the eventual return to the owners? Let's go through this. Again, first column, there's no loan on the property, so we can skip down here. It's $1.4 million purchase, and that's the equity invested, and the return on the assets, again, NOI divided by the cost, that isn't changing, 4.78%. Also the yield, same thing. We've gone through that. Now we're taking this loan again that we came up with in our loan input. This is the $674,410. And the net operating income, again, $66,964. The debt service on this loan, again, interest only, 6.95%. That is $46,871. Structure of the transaction, $1.4 million costs, $674,000 loan, which leaves the equity invested at $725,000. Now, mortgage constant 6.95%, and the return on the assets 4.78. As we talked about, if the mortgage constant is greater than the return on assets, any increase in the amount of the loan on the property, we went from no loan to $674,000, then the return to the investors goes down. 4.78 went down to 2.77. Increase the loan again. In a situation where we have a unfavorable leverage on the property, and the net operating income $66,964. Debt service on this loan, $750,000, is $52,125. That leaves a before-tax cash flow of $14,839. Looking at the structure of the loan, $1.4 million, $750,000 loan, equity invested $650,000. Again, the mortgage constant doesn't change, and either does the return on the assets. Mortgage constant is greater than the return on the assets. So what will happen to the return or the yield to the investors? It will go down, which is what it did here. Okay, we have one more scenario we're going to work through. Here is our final scenario. This is an interest-only loan, but what's going to happen what would happen to the return to the investors if the actual performance of the asset went down? So the net operating income goes down. We're taking it down to $40,000. Looking at the no loan scenario, so the net operating income is $40,000, no debt service, cash flow before taxes, $40,000. The purchase price is $1,004,000, no loan, equity invested $1,004,000. Again, no mortgage constant. The return on the assets, again, taking the net operating income and dividing it by the cost, is 2.86%. And that would be the same for the yield. Next scenario. First of all, the net operating income, $40,000. Debt service on this $674,000 loan, $46,871, which leaves a before-tax cash flow of a negative $6,871. Again, looking at the structure of the transaction, $1,004,000, and the loan amount is $674,410. Equity invested, $725 and $590. Mortgage constant 6.95, that doesn't change. And the return on assets doesn't change, still the same thing. And again, in this scenario, when you have the mortgage constant higher than the return on the asset, there is unfavorable leverage. And so what happens when you went from no loan, 674,000, the return went down to a negative 0.95%. One more loan. This is a loan we increased the loan amount while the net operating income went down. The debt service on that loan is $52,125. There is a negative before-tax cash flow of $12,125. Looking at the structure of the loan again, of the transaction, purchase price $1,004,000, loan $750,000, equity position $650,000. Here is your mortgage constant. The return on assets is lower. So what happens if you when we go from a loan of $674,000 up to $750,000? Well, the return will go down, which is exactly what happened here. The return went down. Okay, that is what I wanted to show you about leverage. And so there is a strategy that we're going to go over later on, see if there are ways that we can find an optimum loan, the one that will result in the highest return to the investors. Okay, I think that's enough for this. So let's just move on to the next topic.